Our presentation this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are, has to do with ethics and how ethics or what ethics looks like from a cultural perspective, or what ethics looks like in terms of TVR programs. There's such a huge difference between what is considered ethical or non-ethical between, like, say, state VR as opposed to tribal VR. And a lot of that I find has to do with um, the fact that we are traditionally serving people that we've either grown up with or interacted with over long periods of time, and sometimes most of our lives. Casey said hello to everyone. So what I'm going to do at this point is share my screen now. In this presentation, I'm going to invite you to do a couple of things. One is I would really like for you to, if you're able, to pull up the current 2023 Code of Federal Regulations for rehabilitation counselors. I'll have the link in the PowerPoint so that you can do that, because this material, along with just LPC counseling code of ethics, was used to put this information together, and I want you to know where that information came from. So let's get to where I can share my screen.
Keith, while you're pulling up your screen, I just wanted to quickly do a real brief introduction. I want to thank Keith for being here to present this topic for AVERTAC. For those of you that don't know Keith, I don't think there's hardly anyone on here today that doesn't know who Keith is. Keith is the rehabilitation specialist with the Oklahoma Department of Rehabilitation Services. Prior to that, he was also a VR counselor with the Apache of Oklahoma Tribal VR program for many years. And he is also an adjunct instructor with Northwest Indian College's TVR Institute. So I just wanted to briefly introduce Keith to anyone who doesn't know who he is, which he's hard to miss.
Yeah, a little hard to miss.
Thank you so much for being here with AVERTAC today and to present on this very important topic of ethics in tribal VR. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, I have a little over 17 years experience in VR. And I would start off by telling anyone who's been here less than that, and I don't think my senior peers would disagree with me, it is such a huge learning curve that you're always learning. You're always learning new things. If you've been in the counselor 3 to 5 years, you're still a baby counselor. You're still learning what it takes not only to balance case management with ethical counseling practices, but just navigating all the changes that go with federal law, state law, your specific policies, all of those different things. And of course, dealing with people in general. Okay, so we're talking about ethics and culture. Okay, I call this walking the tightrope of vocational rehabilitation ethics in a good way, because as TVR counselors, we always want to present ourselves and present our services in a good way. But again, how we do that and how we justify our decisions in that process is really what ethics is about, and understanding what ethics means for us both individually and collectively. If I can get my pointer to work with me. Are you guys seeing the screens okay? Yes? Okay, cool. All right, so in this process today, we're going to review some examples of situations that could be considered unethical or could create what we would call an ethical dilemma. We're going to be using the 2023 CRC Code of Ethics, Professional Ethics, as our guideline, because it is specifically designed for vocational rehabilitation counselors, okay? We're going to review situations where the code itself could potentially create barriers in terms of how we provide services in a culturally appropriate way. And then, of course, acknowledge a very specific proposal on how to process those things in terms of determining an appropriate course of action when we have to do that. Okay. And that's really the biggest outcome is that in dealing with the things that we deal with in terms of American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Services and our client base, how do we justify the decisions we make when someone else comes along and says that's wrong or that's inappropriate? Of course, you're going to rely on, um, let's see, you'll rely on the Rehab Act, of course, you'll rely on all the federal laws that determine what we do. But we're going to kind of break this down into some ethical principles that you can also use. So overall, I always like to start with these questions. Would you consider it appropriate or ethical for a TVR staff member to be involved in case management for a consumer with a substance abuse issue while that counselor themselves are currently being served by the same program for a substance abuse issue? Anybody have to deal with that? What about a TVR program counselor to provide services for a consumer who's their friend or their relative? What about, let's say, a TVR counselor to provide services to a tribal elder because they're on a fixed income and need assistance with their bills or supplies for their art, but not be a TVR consumer? And I want you guys to understand something. All of these case scenarios I'm throwing at you, and they're by far not the full scope, but these are things that I've experienced in my time as a TVR counselor. Okay. Have any of you had a staff member, a TVR staff member themselves receive services through the TVR program and have access to their own case file or authorize their own services? Ethical? Unethical? I can almost hear some of you cringing. What about tribal chairman or uh, the tribal administrator being a consumer of the program while they're working and while they're exercising supervision over your specific position and demanding services for a family member who may or may not qualify for the program? And see, some of these seem really cut and dry, but it really depends on where you are and what you're dealing with. Is it appropriate or ethical for a TVR counselor to provide services to their own family members? Is it? It may not be as cut and dry as you might think. So
I,
in tribal rehabilitation, we are routinely called on to make program related decisions about consumers that, again, that we've grown up with or we've known most of our lives. And that's not the issue. Okay, we're always going to be doing that. Uh, the question is, how do you make ethical decisions about those situations in a very consistent and dependable way that you can justify, whether it's justifying it to your leadership or justifying it in court if it comes to that? And I've had those situations as well. Anyone who's been experienced in these things will tell you it's all about your documentation and how you word it, what you have to say about it. How do you justify it? Okay. And that's really what this training is about today. Um, one of the questions I always ask counselors when I'm talking to them about ethical dilemmas or ethical situation is, do you make decisions based on your personal beliefs and standards? Is that in and of itself considered ethical? No. Is holding everyone in your caseload accountable to your personal beliefs or even in your office? One of the things you're also going to learn today is when we talk about ethics, it's not just pertaining to the relationship between counselors and consumers. It's also pertaining to the relationship between counselors and coworkers, employers. Okay. Let's see. Is it appropriate or ethical? Would it stand up in court? Again, how do you justify this stuff? If RSA comes in and they start asking questions about it, how do you justify your decisions in a way that is considered ethically appropriate? So ethics is, of course, just a branch of philosophy involving a systematically organizing and defending and recommending concepts that are considered right or wrong. Ethics are also used to justify or defend our decisions pertaining to particular case issues or dilemmas that impact consumers' care while receiving services through a TVR program. I had someone ask me, why would you add ethics, something in ethics about a counselor working with their staff? And the primary reason is, and you'll see this later on in our discussion, is because how we interact with each other in the office, even that affects the quality of service that a counselor may provide, especially if what you're saying or doing is harming that counselor. Most of the people I know who are working in TVR programs have disabilities themselves. Is that a part of the consideration when we're working with them? If not, it should be. Okay. Some of the organizations that we traditionally considered to be bound by ethics would include other counselors and social workers, medical office, medical professionals, attorneys and judges, doctors, tribal officials, whether they're elected or appointed, federal employees, and law enforcement. Would anybody disagree with that? That there is a level of standard, there's a level of understanding that if you go into a medical facility, you expect a certain level of care and a certain level of communication, a certain level of professionalism. Okay. VR counselors are held to those standards. So the Code of Professional Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors is designed to provide guidance for the ethical practice of rehabilitation counseling. Again, it is specific to rehabilitation counseling. And there's an interesting thing. I have lots of friends who are LPCs, even TVR counselors and VR counselors who are LPC. But VR counseling is one of those, how do I put this? In VR counseling, you're not just dealing with one aspect of that person's life. And if anybody disagrees, y'all let me know. See, as an LPC counselor, I can talk to someone about their mental health issues, but not necessarily get involved with their housing, whether they have food, whether they have transportation, whether they're employed. It doesn't mean that I can't get involved in those things, but it's not required. Whereas in VR counseling, it is a holistic approach. Anybody disagree with that? Because that's what it's supposed to be. Okay. Especially in terms of looking at our cultures where that's how we grew up. We grew up in a very caring, supportive, or should have been supportive environment, just as Native American people. Yes or no? I mean, that should be a given. Okay, so the primary values that serve as the foundation for the code include respect for human rights and dignity, ensuring the integrity of all relationships, that's both professional and personal, acting to alleviate personal distress and suffering, And I'm real curious, does everyone look at their counseling position or their position in VR this way? Enhancing the quality of professional knowledge and application, not counseling outside of your boundaries. If you're a VR counselor and you're talking to people like you're a mental health counselor, that is wrong. That is unethical. Yes, ma'am. Okay. To increase professional and personal effectiveness. We're also in these positions to promote empowerment through self-advocacy and self-determination. One of the things I really have to preach a lot about, or I find myself preaching a lot about, is that our goal is to create independence and self-sufficiency, not a nurturing, mothering, I'm going to take care of you for the rest of your days relationship. That is not our purpose. Okay. Respecting the diversity of human experience and appreciating culture, recognizing the client's strengths versus their deficits. In other words, requiring the consumer to do everything they can do for themselves. That's a very important part of not just VR counseling, but culturally appropriate VR counseling. Okay. Advocating for fair and adequate provision of services across the board, whether you like them or not, whether you disagree with them or not. So one of the things the federal government really tries to impress is that the fundamental spirit of caring and respect that the code was originally written in is based upon these 6 principles. Oop. Now this is the web address for the 2023 CRC Code of Ethics, if anybody wants to take that and pull that code up while we're having this discussion just to copy it. Cool. If you don't have a copy saved to your desktop, please do so. So again, let's start talking about these individually. So right now, there are 6 principles that guide all VR counseling programs: autonomy, beneficence, fidelity, justice, non-maleficence, and veracity. And if you're able to, it would be good if you would write these down, because we're going to kind of, once we start doing casework or looking at different case scenarios, we're going to be referring back and forth to these. Okay. So autonomy, meaning to respect the rights of the client, to be self-governing. So what does that mean? Anybody want to take a swing at it? Crickets.
I know. I'm waiting for folks to start chatting a little bit this morning. Bambi,
Right?
oh, wait a minute. Sean put something in there. Sean, oh, okay. Sean wants to know if you can share that web address again.
I
Hang on.
will. Okay, go ahead, Kalisha. I can't hear you.
Get on mute, Kalisha. Get off mute.
Okay, I got you. I can hear you.
No, Bambi, your screen name say my name.
I'm Bambi, guys.
Okay, well, you got Kalisha's name on your screen. Go ahead, Bambi.
I don't know how that works. But autonomy is honestly, you can respect their rights, but also encouraging them to work for themselves, to
Sure.
go ahead and look out for yourself. They might not have that initial elementary tool. Nobody may have ever told them that they are in charge of themselves and can do for themselves, or are allowed to ask questions for
Right.
themselves. So autonomy kind of falls into that in my eyes.
Sure. And it's empowering them to do that. It's empowering them to understand that that's our expectations. See, a part of really good ethical counseling is really clarifying, what is this relationship? What is your part? What is my part? If we have a vendor involved, what is their part? When you design your plan, all of that is involved in structuring your plan. But from the very start, The consumer needs to have a clear understanding that I'm not the answer princess, even though I know I look like the answer princess. You know, it's very important to help the consumer understand that they have a very large part to play in the process, and that we as counselors are going to expect that both culturally and socioeconomically, they have the ability to govern themselves. Now, if everything was perfect, they wouldn't be in our office. Okay. And that's something to understand as well. But again, that primary principle of autonomy and respecting their rights to make decisions, it doesn't mean we have to support every single decision, but they still have the right to make the decision. Okay. All right. So the next principle, of course, being beneficence, simply to do good to others, to promote well-being of our consumers. Now, how does that work if well-being from our consumer means helping them get into, say, a substance abuse cessation program, and they decide they don't want to go? That's their right. Okay. But that also tells you where their decision making is and whether or not you can support them moving forward, whether or not they're actually ready to go to work. I'm gonna get off course just a little bit for a second and talk about this. One of the things I see a lot in terms of eligibility determination is counselors not really looking at, is my consumer ready to go to work? What steps do we need to take to make sure you're ready to go to work? That's It's huge. It's more than just getting doctor's documentation that says, here's a diagnosis, there's a diagnosis. It's looking at, like, I have a consumer that just applied, and he's migrantly homeless, meaning he doesn't have a set place that he goes to sleep every night. He's transient. Is he ready for employment? Is he ready for me to put him in front of an employer? Not by any means. Okay. So then we begin to talk about, here's what you need to do next. Here's some possibilities. What would you choose? Well, I'm not ready to do any of that. Then maybe we're not ready for this relationship yet. That's just good counseling. Okay. All right. So get back on track. Fidelity, to be faithful, to keep your promises, and to honor the trust placed in that counselor consumer relationship. What about justice? Are you operating in fair treatment of your consumers and your staff? I've seen staff members talk down to one another. Anyway, just this is all a part of being a good counselor. What about non-maleficence? To do no harm. And of course, veracity is as simple as it gets, to just be honest. But is that easy? Is it always appropriate? Hmm. So in looking at autonomy, let's now begin to talk about the positive sides and some possible negative sides of each one of these principles. So when we're looking at autonomy, again, to respect the rights of the client to be self-governing with their social and cultural framework, acting in a manner that respects that person's freedom to control his or her own life. Okay. Some things that make it good, me looking at competency, giving them the space to make decisions, evaluating whether or not they're able to do that. And that may be just a matter of time. You know, if you have someone who's going through a cessation program and the first time you meet them, they're sauced up, may not be making good decisions at that moment, may not be capable of making good decisions at that moment. Informed decision using accurate information or intellectual capacity and decision skills required. Really looking at the consumer's ability to make decisions. Do they have a severe cognitive disability, intellectual disability? Are they operating at a grade level that says they're not able to make adult decisions? Do they have a legal guardian because of that? Um, what about some of the issues pertaining to autonomy? What if a client's choice, let's not say may be impossible, but what if a client's choice is destructive to the client? What if it's inadvisable? What if it's not a good choice because of the limitations of his or her disability or their experiences or their training or their socioeconomic standing? In state VR, I had a gentleman come in and apply and he said, well, my choice is to work as a midwife for a very specific phyla of porpoises. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, I live in central Oklahoma. Yeah, we don't have any oceans here. We only have 2 people in the state that work at a job like that, and they both have doctorates and work at the big zoo in Oklahoma City. But this gentleman lives in one of the driest areas of Oklahoma and says he wants to work as a midwife for porpoises. Is that his right? 200%. Does that mean we're going to support it? No. What about fidelity? Again, to be faithful, to keep promises, to honor the trust placed in the rehabilitation counselor relationship. And again, of course, that includes to your colleagues. So a good factor pertaining to that is organizational policies and procedures should be designed to do that. The code of ethics is designed to do that. Protecting client information falls under fidelity. Issues with using social media. How many of you maintain contact with consumers over social media, but you don't have a release of information to do that? You haven't had a discussion with the consumer about the negative side of that or the possible negative effects of that. I've met counselors that do it all the time, even post things about them. Keeping a positive working relationship with both consumers and coworkers. Some of the problems are what happens when you inherit a plan that another counselor wrote and you completely disagree with it? How do you operate in fidelity? What about being loyal to but disagreeing with your own program's policy? I used to work for a program, or I worked with a program that had or they fostered the idea that we're here to help you with tires every time you need tires. I'll sign up for that. I need tires. Ethical? Not ethical. Is VR a so I see some laughing faces. uh, so is VR a social program? Is that what we're designed to be? Anybody willing to say yes? No. Okay. What about justice? To be fair in the treatment of all clients and colleagues. Wow, what a spelling on colleagues. To provide appropriate services to all, treating people fairly, especially in allocation of resources. Some good factors that have to do with justice is, of course, treating clients as individuals, treating them fairly. Okay. balancing the scales. If we provide this service for this person, we're going to provide that service for the next person who needs that service. Every person doesn't need the same service. It's individualized, okay? Choosing how to distribute resources, equally evaluating the needs of each person. Notice it says needs, not wants. Looking at client contribution, looking at cost effectiveness. I've seen situations where someone might come in and say, well, I want to do a landscaping business. And the program says, okay, well, we're going to buy you the best John Deere zero-turn tractor there is. Is that cost effective? Especially if that person doesn't have a proven track record of being self-employed? Something to consider. Some of the problems with that is that it requires honesty, and honesty should never be a bad thing, but let me give you a situation. If you get a medical documentation from a psychologist that says that this person is schizophrenic and should never be left alone, are you going to be honest with that consumer and tell them that that's what the report says? Is that appropriate? Are you the person who's supposed to say that?
No.
No.
I
Uh,
second that no.
right. Okay, so looking at all of these things, honesty, introspection, counselor values, stereotypes, biases, and prejudices. That is such a huge thing in VR counseling. And I don't understand why. You have people who, again, most of the people I know, probably 80% of the people I know who work in VR have a disability in and of themselves. But when someone comes in, like, let's say you're not a big fan of heterosexual people or men dressing like women, but somebody comes into the office like that, can you treat them fairly? Can you treat them without bias or prejudice? That's a real question to ask yourself. What about beneficence? Simple beneficence, to do good to others, to promote well-being, acting in a manner that promotes the welfare of your consumers and your coworkers, to just do good. Good factors, of course, include counselor's action will have a reasonable expectation of helping the consumer. That's what we're here for. Our goal is to help you. Our goal is to promote success in your life and help you overcome some things that have been difficult or things that you haven't been able to do on your own. Client is assisted in assessing both the benefits and the harms, as well as the cost and the burdens resulting from their decisions. A big part of counseling right there, pros and cons. Now you get to make a decision. I always tell consumers, I use the scenario that I'm not allowed to tell you you're going to be a ballerina as a professional. You have to make that decision. All I can do is provide you with information, pros and cons. Ballerinas in Chickasha, Oklahoma. I'm not sure about that. Okay.
I'd like to see the labor market report on that, Keith.
Yeah. I've looked it up and there's nothing. So, so some of the problems with that is that, of course, it tends to foster a very paternalistic relationship between counselors and their consumers. It's more like the medical model versus a partnership or a collaboration. That's what VR counseling is a collaboration. What about non-maleficence? That's Sheila Connor's favorite word, non-maleficence. To do no harm
You
to
caught me
others.
off guard for a
I
second.
I know.
You know how when you're at work, you got like 10 other things going on? And I
Yeah,
am paying attention. You're doing a great job.
You're awesome. Thank you. So, acting in a manner that does not cause harm, or at least prevents harm to the consumer. Now, when you look at the CRC Code of Ethics, one of the things the code will tell you is that all principles of the code are balanced in weight, meaning none have more weight than the other. But I would dare to tell you this specific principle, from my experience, carries more weight than anything else. I explained before that I've had a couple of incidences where I had to go to court with someone who claimed they were mistreated. And so our records or our documentation had to show and had to prove that we couldn't do something else that would be less harmful to that participant. Now, one of the issues with that is that balancing protection of client rights versus duties to other in society sometimes comes into play. How many of you in your initial interview talk about the duty to report? Anybody not know what that is? Duty to report? Informing your consumer that if at any time they say they're going to go hurt themselves or they're going to go hurt somebody else, that you have a duty to report. That's a part of non-maleficence. That's a part of providing services within those cultural principles, but knowing when the principle is beneficial or not.
Hey Keith, can I ask, this is Wayne.
Come on,
Sorry
brother.
I'm late to join,
You're good.
but I couldn't stay away. I knew you were talking.
Whatever.
Hey, I'm going to ask you if you could expand on this a little bit about employment goals and how that is connected to the disability. And if we have a right or a responsibility to talk to these individuals when they come in and say, I want to do this job goal, and we can see that it automatically is in direct conflict with their limitations and abilities.
Right.
Can you?
Very good point, Wayne. Very good point. So again, as we're looking through these principles, let's look specifically at non-maleficence. And I'll share a little bit about my background. So before I ever became introduced to VR, vocational rehabilitation, and all of those things, I worked as an industrial electrician. So my prominent job was to install electric motors kind of over my head, maybe 3 stories up, 4 stories up, whatever. I was always in a bucket truck lifting something. Okay. Got both my shoulders ripped out at one time. Lost my job. Doctor said you'll never do that kind of work again, so forth and so on. Okay. Of course, all of my training, all of my background, all of my work experience was in that area. So when I went to my VR counselor, the first thing I wanted to do was what? Go back to what I knew. Yes, 100%. I want my job back. I got bills to pay. I got things to do. Now, my counselor had to weigh what my doctor had to say about it. Was it a danger to me to do that, to go back into a bucket lift and put things over my head? Now, like Wayne introduced, what we have to do is look at, is there the potential for the vocation itself to cause harm? Now, it doesn't mean Keith didn't have the right to choose that specific job, but I would have to tell Keith, okay, you're going to have to do that on your own because that's something we can't support, but you have to document that. You have to document how you came to that conclusion. What documentation did you use to justify that decision that a VR program is not going to support that? Now, if Keith wants to do electrical board stuff on a table where it's not over its head, it's not 300 pounds, blah, 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 that's a whole different situation. That's trying to connect the consumer to something at least close to what they wanted to do. The consumer always has a right to choose, but as VR counselors, we have the responsibility to make decisions about whether or not that's going to cause harm to that consumer. Now we have to document that appropriately. That cover that, Wayne?
Can I add to that?
Please.
As a vocation rehabilitation counselor or counselor, you meet the individual where they're at.
Sure.
In your regular schedule meetings and preparing the IEP, this is the opportunity to discuss their ideas, their goals, but also how you can actually make those happen. If there's limitations, you work around them and still guide them towards that goal, but you may not have to go the direct route. And that's where, as a counselor, you're being creative in how they can reach that goal.
Sure. But there's also the creativity that comes in a situational assessment.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you something. So the lady I had as a counselor, she wasn't the
Thank you.
you're very welcome. Thank you for sharing, Mark. Um, she wasn't the sharpest pencil in the box. She already had an idea of what she wanted me to do, and she really wasn't interested in what I had to say about that. But one of the things she did do is in her office, she had a box of things, and I had already pointed it out. I would have to take a motor like that, lift it up, do this, so forth and so on. And she said, okay, we'll help you pursue that vocation if you can pick that box up over your head. Now, there's some right and some wrong to that. There's some assistive technology that could help in certain situations, but I knew that the job I did, the type of technology they had at that time, and again, we're talking back 1999, there was not assistive technology that would help me lift a 300-pound motor over my head within the space that I had to do it in. One of the reasons I was hired for that job was because of my size and my strength and all of that stuff. But what she did in that instant situational assessment is help me understand the reality of where I was at that time. Now, still to this day, I can't lift things over my head like I used to. And the way she went about it wasn't necessarily the best way to do it, but it caused me to ask questions. And to me, that's what good counseling is helping the consumer ask themselves realistic questions about their choices. Anybody disagree with that? Okay, let's move on from non-maleficence. What about veracity? To just be honest, honesty, truthfulness with clients, coworkers, colleagues, so forth and so on. It's good because it balances unequal relationships by being honest, ensure that client understands their role and the responsibilities in the VR process. It ensures client understands intended use of VR services. Tests, reports, diagnostic documentation. Problem is, truth may result in psychological harm or emotional pain. Anybody disagree with that? All right. So again, reminding you of some of the ethical principles, and these certainly aren't all of them. Relatives of tribal leaders as clients, tribal leaders themselves as consumers, growing up or being related to your consumers, tribal elders who are consumers, confidentiality. We all are familiar with the moccasin grapevine. You may not call it the moccasin grapevine, but that's what we call it around here. staffing issues decided by tribal leaders instead of the VR program staff. Counselors related to or paid as vendors. And again, these aren't made up. These are situations I've worked through for years. Tribal leaders threatening counselors to go against ethics, even the law, in order for that tribal leader to be able to access client or financial information. Having a personal or romantic relationship with a client in any capacity other than professional interaction, any at all. And I'm telling you, I've met counselors who were paying rent for consumers while that person was on the program and dating that person at the same time, making car payments for them, buying them groceries with VR monies. Yeah, shock and awe. Okay. And I actually had a counselor, this last one, this romantic relationship. I had a counselor tell me that they could justify that. I said, yeah, I'd like to see that book. Okay. So we've talked about ethical principles. We talked about some situations that could be considered unethical. One of the things I want to encourage you guys to do as we get into talking about case scenarios and justification is I need you to remember something. Okay, so I've worked in offices where we had 4 full-time counselors, 2 full-time techs, someone who answered the phone up front, a program manager, a job developer, just a full staff, okay? But I've also worked in offices where there was only one counselor and they had no tech, but there was someone who answered the phone, or maybe there was a program director who would also have to carry a caseload, and where they were related to each other, the counselor and the program director. Okay. So in this process, think about those things. Keep those things in mind when you start looking at them. So when we start talking about how do you justify a decision, how do you document how you came to that conclusion, how you came to that decision, this is a 6-step process. And I didn't design this. This is something I was taught when I was in graduate school. First, you review the situation to determine what are the 2 decisions. And let's just start off using Keith in the case scenario. One scenario says, let's say you're going to buy Keith tires. One says you're not going to buy Keith tires. Okay, something really simple. All right. Then we're going to look at the factually based reasons that support that decision. Okay. I live in a region of Oklahoma that does not have public transportation at all. We don't have taxis. We don't have buses. We don't have transits. A couple of the tribes have vans, but those are reserved for elder transportation or medical transportation. Oh, what happened? So yeah, transportation is a big deal. That could be a justification right there. That could be a factually based reason for supporting buying Keith tires. Once you list the reasons that support that decision, well, why do I keep doing that? So given the reasons supporting each course of action, identify the ethical principles that support those reasons. So if we say, well, transportation is a bad deal, let's go back up to each one. Okay, there we go. Let's go back up to our principles. Which principles support buying Keith tires? Because transportation, public transportation, is not something that's going to be available to Keith in his region. What'd you say, Sheila Connors? I can't hear you.
Justice,
Sure.
so
To
that
be
we can be
fair.
fair in the treatment to all consumers and staff, and it would be appropriate services if there's no other transportation provided.
Okay. That's good
So there's not a
justification.
comparable benefit there. That
Right.
would be one reasoning.
Okay. That's good
But-
consideration right there. Who else?
But
Mark?
the bottom line is, how is it related to employment or seeking employment or training? That's my
Okay, so
justification.
okay, so let's clarify that. Let's
Mhm.
say that Keith has been let's say Keith went to work doing electrical again, and the employer of choice is a 45-minute drive every day to check in, get your duty list, and then go out and provide services. But you still have to drive 45 minutes to the workplace to get your truck, get your tools, get your parts, and then go on out and do your job. Um, who else would throw out a different principle? We got justice. What about the fact that Keith is the one that came to you to ask for tires?
Hmm.
What about beneficence? Does beneficence support the program buying tires?
Yes, because
Let's,
it's
huh?
based on his objective and why he came into the program, which
Mhm.
is related to work and employment and maintaining that employment.
Okay.
It's not for recreational purposes.
Right, that is correct. That is a pro towards supporting the reason for
Mhm.
buying him tires to go to work. Okay. Now, what about, let's get back to our principles. Now let's look at the decision choice to not buy him tires. What ethical principles support not buying him tires? Are there any? Is Keith working? Does Keith have other income?
Mhm.
We already talked about the fact that there is no public transit. Is there a relative that works at the same company that can take him to work every morning?
No.
Those are questions to ask. Well, what principles would support that if there are? Okay, let's flesh this out a little bit more. Let's say that okay, Keith has accepted this job, but Keith was already working. Keith already had a bank account and already had some savings in the bank. Um, or he had a relative that was willing to lend him money to buy tires so that he could begin to go to work. What ethical principles would say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to pay for your tires because you do have some other possibilities. Are there any? Don't be guys, don't be afraid. This is a discussion
Well,
because there is no set right answer for any specific decision.
I wouldn't, there would be a time limit on this. It wouldn't be forever. I think at some point you would have to decide when he becomes um fully independent and on his own, where he can support the cost of his transportation back to this job site. It could be before the job site ends or what have you, but it's not going to be an ongoing payment or assistance.
Right.
The program is to help him establish himself. Once he established himself, then you could send him on his way.
Independence and
Right.
self-sufficiency.
Right.
There's also the importance of that discussion
Mhm.
while you're even writing that plan, helping the consumer understand this is a one-time event.
Mhm.
We're not going to be here for you to come around the next year and ask for tires. That a part of your employment you need to understand is the requirement for you to set aside money knowing that you're going to need tires in the future. Should that or should that not be a part of that discussion?
I think that that covers the fidelity, but on the consumer side of that relationship, because that consumer could be more honest and forthcoming about what resources they have versus what they
Right.
don't, and help the program meet them where they need to be met instead of,
Mhm.
hey, you guys can buy it for me. That's not true.
Right. 200%. 200% right there. Has there been any discussion about if there's a tribal social service program? Are there any other programs that can support buying tires? All of those things come into play, but all I really want you to do is begin to flesh out the pros and the cons in that decision. It could be a decision about paying for supplies for someone who wants to make shawls. Go ahead, Jamie.
Oh, I was just reading, Casey made a good comment over, and it was something I was thinking about too. She said, Veracity, does our policy support
Yes,
this
ma'am.
hire? And, I was thinking in my mind, what does your policy say about
Right.
purchasing? Like some programs say you have to have valid insurance and registration
Right.
before we will purchase tires or do any type of vehicle modification.
Yeah, I see Sheila holding her hands up too.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I'm glad that Casey brought in the policy statement there. Yes, yes, Sheila, go ahead.
No,
I was
Go ahead.
agreeing with Kima. Am I saying your not name correctly? Keeoma. We have to have 3 quotes.
Yelma, yeah.
And then Keith asked about, why would we not pay for tires? And my thought was to do no harm to others. What if our client has no driver's license, no insurance, has a DWI,
Yes,
DUI?
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
We can't in good conscience buy this person tires, even though he or she may or may not have a job.
Right.
How can we in good conscience buy
Right.
tires with no,
No.
because in North Carolina, you have to have insurance.
Yeah.
You have to have a driver's license. Needless to say, I have people come in here and saying, I don't have any driver's license, but I'm driving.
Yeah.
Can I
Well,
in good conscience do anything?
right. And again, it's such an important factor to talk about policy. One of the first things anybody should do when they're trying to make these decisions is look at your policy. What does your policy have to say? I've read policies that said we'll buy tires every 6 months. I really have. I, I know I was just as shocked, but I'm telling you, they're out there. Matter of fact, I was in communication with a VR program where the program director used to direct the social service program. And so she brought those same principles over to the VR program without looking at what does the Code of Federal Regulations say? What's the purpose? What are the things that the grant itself outlines that we're supposed to do? Are you familiar with those things? Because you should be familiar with those things before you ever dive into making decisions like these. It's really important, guys, really important. Okay. All right. So I want to make sure everyone understands. So in this process, and let me get back down to a
It's been there.
process.
I'm in training. I'm in training. Could you?
Okay, cool. So again, in this 6-step process, you're going to review the situation. What decisions am I trying to make? Pro or con? Do it or don't do it? Buy it, don't buy it? Assist with it, don't assist with it? What are the decisions you're trying to make? And usually it's just two. List the factual based reasons that support that decision. Once you have facts that support that decision, then what ethical principles support those facts? You're going to do the same step with the cons. If there's negative connotations to making the decision, like in this case, it's not buying the tires. Okay, what facts-based reasons support not buying the tires? And then what ethical principles support those reasons? This is how you document what your decision is in a way that is supported. It's not just your opinion. It's not because, well, Mark's hair is a little long for me. I don't like Mark. He wears glasses. It's not that stuff.
Mhm.
Sheila's a different tribe than I am, so I don't really like that tribe, blah, blah, blah. It has nothing to do with those things. Here's the facts. Here's the ethical principles that support those facts. Here's how I came to that conclusion. Does that make sense to everyone? Fixing to get on my preaching box. Okay, so let's look at some situations, okay? Uh, Rehabilitation counselor recognize the quality of interaction with colleagues can influence the quality of services. We'll talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about some case scenarios, some real case scenarios. So let's say Keith is the VR counselor and Keoma comes in to apply for services. Now, notice I said Keith is the VR counselor, not one of many, not several. Keith is the only VR counselor. Okay. Keoma comes in to apply for services, and come to find out, Keoma is related to Keith's ex-girlfriend. She's a tribal member. She's got a diagnosed condition that speaks to the fact that that condition acts as an impediment to employment. Should Keith be her counselor? Why or why not? Okay, I see heads shaking both ways. Let's talk about again the decision to be a counselor or not be the counselor for this person. And it looks real cut and dry, but let's justify it. Okay. So the decision is to be the counselor or not be the counselor. What factual reasons justify Keith being the counselor?
He's the only
There's-
one.
He's
I was
the
about to
only
say there's
one.
no other counselor.
Okay. That's one reason for sure. Seriously. Are there any other reasons that justify Keith being the counselor? That's really the biggest
He's
one. Go ahead.
Uh,
Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was gonna
this
say
this
he's
is
not related to her. His
Okay.
ex-girlfriend is.
That's factual. Come on, y'all. One more.
well, she may be related to the his ex-girlfriend, but that doesn't explain, what relationship that Keith and, this new member might have. So,
Correct.
there may not be anything that says that he shouldn't be the counselor. I mean, they could be, friendly and as long as Keith sits there and says, "Hey, here's the rules and policies and procedures that we need to follow. Here's, the guideline. Here's your way of being able to, if you believe I'm not doing things correctly, here's an avenue to be able to, have your case heard and pleaded, and just set the boundaries and,
Sure.
make sure that you're doing everything professional."
200% setting those boundaries. Are there any reasons that justify Keith not being the counselor? Do, 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 do,
You would assume that
do.
he wouldn't be the only person available. I would assume that there could potentially be a supervisor, or is he the supervisor?
Okay,
Like,
that's
why
one.
wouldn't he go to the supervisor and have them
Take over
take
that
care of it?
case, right? Okay, that's one. One more. What if
How
Keith thinks he's gonna get back in with old girl? Like, you know, man,
Oh,
man, if
feel
I go ahead.
Or
Let's
what if he,
say that
eh,
Keith is okay, so almost this woman's son-in-law, but he left her daughter at the altar and she hates him.
It's happened, y'all. She hates his guts.
Yes.
Okay, so again, we're just looking for reasons. You know, there's so many possibilities, but let's just go with those. So with the having the possibility of a senior or a supervisor or a program director that could take the case, that's one reason why Keith shouldn't be the counselor for this person. What ethical principle supports that? This isn't hard, guys. Beneficence could be one. Fidelity could be one. Justice could be one. Non-maleficence could be one. What ethical principles support the idea that Keith could be the counselor for this person?
I would say veracity
Yes, sir.
and autonomy, because you have the IEP, the goals and objectives that you're creating with this individual, and that is the blueprint on how you are going to negotiate and work with this individual. Anything outside of that is not really according to why he's in the program with you. And you have additional support. You have the job developer and the supervisor who are also going to be interacting with this individual as well as yourself. So
I
there's
see what you're saying. Yeah, it's not just going to be Keith on the lone island.
right. And
Okay,
so a lot of things are going to have to be discussed with his colleagues on this individual's development according to that IEP.
sure.
Maybe all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's complicate this just a little bit more. Let's say Keith does become the counselor for this person, and this is something I've seen thousands and thousands of times. The case is successful. This person goes to work, and maybe they go to work at, I don't know, J.C. Penney's, Walmart, and they bring in a $50 gift card as their way of showing appreciation. Do you accept the gift card? Do you not accept the gift card? Come on. And not just that, how do you justify that culturally? What is culturally appropriate?
our policies and procedures say we can't accept gifts of like certain dollar amounts, but if it's cultural, like food or something that was made for you, then it's insulting if you don't.
Yeah, it's insulting. Um, I went out to an elder's house, and the elder offered me this glass. Um, and of course, there were people on staff that were mad because we brought it back to the office. There were people on staff that said, no, that was the right thing to do. But how do you justify that decision using facts and using ethical principles to do that.
I'd
Go
say
ahead,
it's
Kioma.
non-maleficence, do no harm, because in that moment I made the choice to not, I mean, because knowing, especially if they're elders and it's something that doesn't have like a monetary gift, it's more
Right.
of like a sentimental thing, then yeah.
Yeah, you know, we're not talking about a $50 bill or $100 bill or something I could turn around and go sell, but it it maintains my relationship with the elder, beneficence. Okay. Culturally, I was faithful and kept my word that I would pay attention to our culture, because where I am, if you turn away from that gift, that relationship is done. I'm not accepted in that house again.
Mhm.
But I had to document again, how did I come to that conclusion? How did I decide this is the appropriate thing to do when I had other people saying, I'm going to turn you in. You out here taking stuff from elders. Well, then you don't understand what I'm doing. Okay. Any questions about that? We've got what, 15 minutes left, Jamie?
Yes, that's right, Keith. And we're also going to do a survey at the end as well.
Okay, so is there anyone who wants to talk about a situation? I don't want to say that you're necessarily dealing with right now because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But is there any situations that you want to throw out there and just kind of get your peers' perspective of as it relates to ethics?
I have
Jamie,
a
I can't.
person.
Go ahead.
I have a person that I know is limited physically, and in the past, we did help her start her business. She put in on her supplies, and there was no issue. However, here we are a little more than 4 years later, let's approximate, and she's less able than she was when we first started this with her. And she's seeking what seems to be post-employment services, but there's a caveat where it possibly duplicates services that have been given to her. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the other approaches you guys may take to that type of situation where you knew this person, they were in the program, they were a success, but they came back after post-employment, after they've started their business, and they are not physically able the way they were 4 years ago.
Okay.
How do we manage that?
Okay, so we're gonna send this out to the group, but I'm gonna ask you some questions for clarification. Okay, so one, what does your policy say, or how does your policy define post-employment? And here's why I ask. Okay, so for the program that I work for now, post-employment is something that's offered after the person has gone to work, but before I close them successfully. That's what my policy says. So I would want to know what your policy says. And one of the other things that's required, if a person comes back in for us, for the program I work for now, and they reapply for services, again, basically the same services, the first thing we look at is, has your disability changed?
Mhm.
And we reevaluate that in terms of what your capabilities are, what your goal is. Is there any assistive technology that would help you fulfill that goal or fulfill that job, so forth and so on? So is there any clarification you can add related to those things?
This person came to us at 40%. I'm able to do this. There's, little problem, but not right now. Their functioning is about 70% less. Like, it was 40% they were missing. Now they're missing 70% of that capability. And what they want to do involves basically a screen printer, and screen printers, as you know, they're pretty heavy and you can't just do it. And that's what the post-employment service is that's being requested.
For to buy another printer? What's
Yeah,
the, okay, so
it's a different
uh
type of printer. So she is believing that's a different service, but I know that a printer is a printer. And if it
well,
does the same functionality that the first printer had with,
okay,
it's just sparklier, then that's not, I'm not a counselor, again, just for disclosure, but
good,
this is something that I'm witnessing and I do have questions about. Sorry.
okay, so let's address a couple of things. So one, you've already stated that the disability has changed, okay? That there's obvious, and
It's the same, it's
here's
just the more severe.
right, right. So, but that means change. It's changed in terms of that person's capacity, okay? One other thing that we do when we're trying to make these decisions is do what's called a worksite evaluation. So one of the things I probably would look at in terms of the printer is to find someone who has that printer and take that consumer to see if they can operate that printer.
So Keith,
Because, go ahead.
this is Rebecca.
No kidding.
I told you it was not,
Right?
I was like, I am not gonna say anything. I'm not, and then, okay. So here's a couple things to think about. Number one, a lot can happen in 4 years. For most post-employment situations in tribal VR, post-employment is a year to a year and a half
Okay.
after that case comes to closure. And that's because, again, a lot can happen. Secondly, the minute you have a change in disability and that person is coming back for services, it is a case reopen. It would not be a post-employment because the impediments are going to be different. The disability is different in terms of what they're dealing with. So you have to go back through the eligibility process. And as you walk through each of those 6 pieces of the eligibility process, you're going to be looking at, can this person benefit in terms of a successful employment outcome? This is where that trial work piece comes in that Keith is talking about. Because if this person's disability has worsened to that degree, and you think they are not capable of working, your due diligence is to do trial work experience to confirm that your belief is true or to show you that it's not true. And so there's a whole process here. It isn't just a person coming back and saying, buy me a printer. Again, what do your policies and procedures say? Because most policies and procedures that are written around post-employment don't allow for 4 years to be the time frame.
Right. Now, I want to stress at this point, and this is not necessarily pertaining specifically to ethics, but trial work is always the tool that you're going to use anytime you think a person's disability makes them incapable of pursuing an employment goal. Okay. And so there's some research into what trial work looks like. What does your policy say about trial work? What does that process look like for both you as staff and the consumer? How long does it last? So forth and so on. And I will state this because I have experience with this, at least here in Oklahoma. I've seen printers that are lighter than others. I've seen printers that have a lighter draw weight, which is just the weight it takes to pull the lid down. I've also seen printers that the lid is operated with one arm instead of 2 arms overhead. So there's just a lot of research, I think, that would go into that, but I don't think carte blanche, I would say, no, this is not something we're going to do. It's walking through those principles. It's walking through the factual reasons why you would or would not support doing that. But in your specific case, there's a lot of research that needs to be done there, both in terms of a trial work experience and some research about what's the difference between this printer and that printer. Anybody else have anything to add to that? Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, guys.
Ah, I knew she couldn't
Oh,
stay quiet the whole time. Go ahead, Jamie.
I just wanted to say we are quickly running out of time,
Right.
but discussions are wonderful. And I want to invite everyone to come back next week, same time, next Wednesday, September 18th, 10 to 11. Dr. Lee Gashioma will be leading a talking circle on this topic. And I would love for everyone to come back and let's hash out some of these scenarios.
Yes.
Keith will be on with us as well to answer more questions, and it'll just be a real informal talking circle, no recording. We'll just talk it out. So please come back next Wednesday, because there is a lot of good information. And yeah, Bambi, yes, you'll get the invite. It'll come out in this week's announcements and how you register. Keith, I want to thank you so much. This has been a wonderful webinar. The time just flew by. But I love the fact that we're just talking out some of these scenarios and some of these questions. We've learned a lot about ethics today, and I just want to thank everyone for being here. Miles, I think you have a survey that you're going to put up. Thank you.
I just want to remind everyone, if you get a chance to go to Lee's Talking Circle, please bring those case scenarios, because that'll really be a place where we can just kind of talk without guard. Again, it's not going to be recorded or anything like that. It'll be of great benefit to kind of walk through the things you're actually dealing with on site without having to worry about who hears or whatever, and have some discussion about it.
And please, yes, fill out this survey because it really helps us when we're developing training materials and moving forward. And also, if you need CRC credits for today's session, I put my email in the chat box. Send me an email requesting those. And thank you again, Keith. It has been a wonderful webinar, and I appreciate you taking the time to present this topic to everyone.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate you. I appreciate y'all being here. And I sure hope this helps you just a little bit. We kind of skimmed over ethics with the time we had, but I appreciate it very much.